They claim to be there to protect the journalists from a conservative website, but their heavily armed presence on the streets of Ferguson drew the attention of both police and black protesters. The men, calling themselves Oath Keepers, only added to the already simmering tensions 1 year on from the fatal police shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown. Well, our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins us now live from Ferguson. Kylie, over to you.
Well, Matt, we're here in what was the epicenter of the riots, the protests, the looting that followed the killing of Michael Brown a year ago, 18-year-old unarmed Michael Brown, by the white police officer Darren Wilson. Now, the reverberations from those protests have really changed America. They continue to move around America. Now, if you want to be the next president of the United States, you've got to be prepared to talk about Black Lives Matter and issues of race and injustice. Indeed, people are saying, members of the younger generation, the younger activists in this crowd are saying, look, this is our great civil rights moment. But it was a moment that was somewhat interrupted last night by, as you mentioned, these Oath Keepers. It was a very small cohort from that organisation. They came along, as you say, to protect journalists. We have seen them before, I've got to say, in the Ferguson protest back in November, when the court behind me announced that Darren Wilson would not be charged over Michael Brown's killing. They were hidden away up on some of the porches and the awnings of some of the stores in Ferguson. They said to protect businesses last night. As you mentioned, Matt, they were here apparently to protect journalists. But certainly their presence, their very kind of visible state of wearing uniforms, military-type uniforms, some of them are ex-military, some of them are even serving police, we're told, and they were, you know, carrying weapons. As you can imagine, their presence really drew a mixed reaction. This was last night in Ferguson. The lines of chanting protesters forced to keep on moving or face arrest, the riot-clad police making arrests, giving orders, using mace. But emerging from the shadows, new to the neighbourhood, men who call themselves Oath Keepers. Vigilantes acting, they say, to protect journalists from a popular right-wing website from any trouble. They openly carry sidearms and semi-automatic weapons, as is their right in the state of Missouri. The protesters, though, had questions.
You and people who look like you, white males, have the sovereignty to walk around with assault rifles, but we can't even stand out here and assemble peacefully and exercise our constitutional right to do so without being gassed, maced, and arrested. What's your perspective on that? What do you think about that?
I don't have a perspective.
You don't have a perspective?
But there was common ground among others, at least one Oath Keeper engaging a protester in lively conversation over Donald Trump and tax policy.
The sales tax does not apply to goods.
Let's just have a flat tax.
Yesterday evening, before darkness fell, protesters closed all 10 lanes of a major highway. Their lines eventually broken by police, who arrested dozens of people, in one case using strong-arm tactics to flip a protester onto the road. The county declared a state of emergency after gunfire on the sidelines of Sunday night's protests. The police shot and critically wounded one 19-year-old who they say had shot at them.
We saw things spiral out of control. I can tell you that our community has come too far and has worked too hard to be set back again.
But it's hard to know how this keeps the peace, putting civil rights leaders in handcuffs, including the prominent philosopher Cornel West and Black Lives Matter activist DeRay Mackison, during a peaceful sit-in outside the federal court. This place is now synonymous with the protest that began a year ago after the killing of Michael Brown. Ferguson may have changed America and restarted the conversation around race and injustice, but the fight for change in this St. Louis suburb, where everything began, isn't over yet. So I'm joined now by DeRay Mackison, who's one of the kind of most prominent voices and co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. DeRay, let's just first start with your arrest yesterday. Do you know why you were arrested?
Yeah, it appears that it was an unusual obstruction of a usual entryway or entrance.
So you were sitting too close to the doorway?
I actually wasn't sitting at all. So my partner Netta, she was filming the police, and I was also filming, but from a different vantage point, and she had gotten arrested for filming. So I came over to question her arrest, and I was arrested as well.
You haven't been arrested here before. Do you feel like there's some sense of kind of scores being settled by the authorities at the moment?
You know, I think that there's a long history of law enforcement targeting people who are fighting for their rights. You know, the reality is that the status quo didn't just happen overnight. The status quo is over many years, and people will work hard to reinforce it, including the police.
Has there been any change? I mean, if you're a regular citizen of Ferguson, do you think there's been any change in terms of the way you're treated by the police now to a year ago?
You know, I think that across the country, there's more of a critical lens to the police, that people are willing to question police narratives, and there's a focus on police violence and racism in ways that it just wasn't a year ago, and that's really powerful. I think that, like, the Ferguson Police Department has a lot of work to do. They are pushing back on the consent decree and not realizing that they need to...
The consent decree is the Department of Justice orders on the changes they have to make, the reforms.
There's a negotiation that happened with the consent decree in Ferguson. The Ferguson Police Department is not being a willing participant right now, and they're pushing back, which shows that they don't yet realize that they have a lot of work to do.
Tell me about how polarizing, in a way, the movement has become, not necessarily your movement, but there is a right-wing pushback against the Black Lives Matter movement, which feels more and more vociferous every day. How do you deepen the effect of your movement without increasing that polarization?
So we know that this work will always be more important than it is popular. And there are people, like I said, the status quo didn't just come overnight. There are people whose bread and butter is like sustaining these oppressive racist systems like for-profit prisons, right? The right's response to us is a sign that the movement's working, right?
So the Oath Keepers' presence last night, do you connect that at all to that kind of right-wing pushback? Why do you think they were here, and what was your reaction to their presence?
Yeah, the presence of the Oath Keepers is a reminder that the police here police based on race. If black people had come out with rifles like that, it would have been sheer pandemonium outside. But white people, there was no response by the police. They left, they didn't return, and that's real. That policing is racially coded in places like Missouri and places all over the country.
How long do you think it will take before Black Lives Matter, the movement, becomes irrelevant?
Yeah, you know, the reality is that it took us a year to expose and convince the terror of police violence, to expose it and then tell people and convince them that it was real. I think that what we'll see in the next year is a focus on solutions and a conversation about how do we end it. The protest will end when injustice ends, and not a moment before.
Okay, Jermaine Mackison, thank you very much for joining us. That's all from Ferguson. Now it's back to you in London.